Good morning. Welcome to this morning's Psyfeld discussion on the little kicks. All right, so who would like to unmute and identify something you saw in this selected Seinfeld episode to begin our discussion? Anyone? I assure you there's no wrong answer. Viewer's choice. How about we pick a character?
I found it interesting how Jerry was kind of hesitant to do was very hesitant to do the filming of the movie. And then we kind of see him kind of progress into like not like being proud of it, but kind of thinking like, oh, I can't have him know that I shot this and it was like poorly filmed. Kind of like he feels a little bit like esteemed over, yeah. Yes, nor having kind of like a ego boost over it.
Yep. So how would you describe or how would you make sense of Jerry's initial reaction? Let's take that in isolation for just a second. Anyone? How does Jerry's initial reaction, and this is going to be a little sensitive, so if you're not comfortable, obviously you're not going to unmute, of not wanting to do it compared to perhaps your own? What might be guiding what we see when, I guess initially he doesn't want to film the movie, to tape the movie? Fear of what?
Of like not being good enough, maybe.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I think it might even start there, right? So, and again, I'm not going to have anyone unmute. So I want you to just reflect on how that may be congruent with your initial reaction too. Now, you've been in this clerkship, you've been in this internship for a little while now. And my gut says is that perhaps 100% of you would have done the same thing. So why? And I want your answer to be from a psychiatric, if not Freudian perspective. What's governing that behavior? I'll give you a hint. It rhymes with super schmigo. You guys are making me read the chat room here. Exactly right. So we have an aspect of Jerry Seinfeld, the character's personality that seems to be super ego driven. So on tests, that means his behavior is guided by the reality principle. He has a fear of breaking the law. And these are values that have been instilled in him originally by his parents, as Freud would render an opinion. However, we see his view change, pardon the pun, and he begins to not only be okay with filming, but take some pride in his work to the point where he doesn't even want one of the films or one of the recordings to be associated with his name. So why the change? Again, from that same Freudian perspective, what's going on here? What happened to Jerry's superego? Well, this is where you look at ego strength, right? So we know the superego is going to be in conflict with Jerry's id, as the superego is always in conflict with our id. The result is friction that Freud coined anxiety, And to alleviate that anxiety, that third and final component of our subconscious, of our personality, has everything to do with resolution of that anxiety via these subconscious or ego defense mechanisms. And we see a breakdown in Jerry's ego here. We see a weak ego strength, which is likely manifest through Jerry's behavior later on in the episode, and his not only willingness to do this, breaking the law to do it, but taking pride in it as well. And so I think if you focus on the character of Jerry Seinfeld in The Little Kicks and focus on his change of heart, if you will, in making those illegal recordings, we have a brief overview, a very brief overview of Freudian theory as it explains our subconscious and therefore our personality development. Anything else from Jerry Seinfeld in The Little Kicks that caught your attention or you want to discuss this morning?
I kind of found it interesting how, like, when he did shift, he also rationalized it with the kid that he saw on the street and like saying it's for the kids kind of thing. But yeah, I guess that's like another defense mechanism.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. We see a maladaptive defense in Jerry Seinfeld here, perhaps rationalization, that allows him to alleviate that anxiety that's caused between that friction, because now he is id driven. He's acting on his impulse. Yeah, I agree. It's for the children. What are the characters you want to discuss this morning? By the way, I should, this is more of a clinical pearl for our clerks. Probably not going to come up on an exam, but clinically, the original classification of these defense mechanisms by Valiant were along 3 or 4 categories: mature, immature, narcissistic, etc. And those still hold true in terms of quote unquote textbooks, if there are such things as textbooks. In clinical practice in 2022, we really don't, or we're not held to that same classification system. So you may hear people like myself refer to some defenses as mature versus immature. But the reality is that in clinical practice, all we're worried about are those that are adaptive versus those that are maladaptive. So much, I think, more clinically oriented classification. Adaptive versus maladaptive. And I'll give you an example. And Jerry Seinfeld's a wonderful example for this too. Humor, per Valiant's classification, is considered to be a mature defense. Yet, in multiple episodes of this series, we can see that Jerry Seinfeld's use of humor is maladaptive and causes clinically significant stress or impairment. So, great example there of what Valiant would have called a mature defense, maybe being even the etiology of some pathology in the character of Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian.
Has anybody brought up how Elaine just straight up denies any sort of personal character flaw throughout the entirety of this episode?
When you say denies character flaw, can you be more specific?
Well, so she's very much like, people think I'm weird because I dance like an 80-year-old grandmother at a barbecue. She absolutely refuses that. She's like, no, it has to be because George is weird. Which is just I mean, that fits. Elaine's narcissistic, but so that totally fits, that any sort of negative thing on her can't possibly be because of actually her. So it totally tracks with her just sort of trajectory as a character. But it is pretty amusing to me that she like fails to grasp that her for the entire episode, even sort of at the very end when everybody makes fun of her with their dancing, and B, that her like persistence on it not being a her problem ends up like working in George's favor. Well, part of the episode, in that like he gets painted as the bad boy, and because the show sort of simplifies interpersonal dynamics and casts sort of how people perceive each other in terms of attraction and somewhat in sometimes problematic and possibly oversimplified ways, the bad boy is always attractive. So
let's get into that a little bit. Elaine, and I'd go so far as to say Jerry and George as well, and even include Kramer, albeit perhaps in fourth place in this conversation, are all egocentric. And I think that's where the conversation starts. We have four egocentric characters here, borrowing the term from psychology, developmental psychology, individuals that lack the capacity to view any situation from any vantage point but their own. Layperson's terms, self-absorbed. That's Jerry, that's George, that is Elaine. And to a large extent as well, it's Kramer. Egocentric. Egocentrism is normal when age appropriate. Children ages 2 on believe that the world does revolve around them. That is perfectly normal. And that's for better or for worse. Something traumatic happens in the household, the child blames themselves. They must have caused it. And again, completely normal and really a focus of child psychology. However, at some point, we outgrow that. And we begin as people to, as children, to develop empathy. And that is begin to view situations, experiences through others' vantage points, in addition to our own. And these four characters never develop that. And to your point, in the little kicks, in this scene that you identify, that really does explain Elaine here. Now, of course, if this results in clinically significant distress or impairment, the question for the clinician is why? And we have some picture as to how we would answer that question for Elaine, given not this particular episode, but other episodes in or during these 9 seasons. We're not going to get into a lot of that today, but that would be the focus of clinical attention, especially in psychotherapy. The other thing I want to bring up is this idea of egocentrism, because from it, in the most egregious form, the individual can actually develop narcissism and therefore is at risk for developing narcissistic personality disorder. That particular personality disorder does overlap, cluster with antisocial personality. Both are in cluster B. And I only bring that up because of George in this episode being the quote unquote bad boy. And somehow elements of antisocial personality are attractive. And that's something that we do see in clinical practice, that the charisma, individuals with this condition, now we're talking about antisocial personality, can actually be alluring or charismatic in some way. There's a nice bridge between Elaine, her egocentrism that she's demonstrating, and how this clusters with other personality disorders, including but not limited to antisocial, which of course is kind of also addressed in this episode, albeit by a different character, and that's the character of George. So flipping over to George now, any comments, any observations on George's character in the little kicks? Not much.
I mean, George is kind of amusing in that George is simultaneously, he gives off these narcissistic vibes, but at the same time throughout the series, which you see in other relationships or dalliances that he has, he very much comes off as like dependent. A lot of his self-worth seems to revolve around these issues. There's like that one like the shrinkage episode or like the lasagna episode. Like George is very much like depicted as someone whose self-worth is predicated on other people finding him interesting or attractive. So he's very willing to take on, or at least sort of adapt or try and project the persona of a bad boy if it means someone else will find him interesting.
That's exactly right. This is social learning theory, and what you described is referred to as an external locus of control. His self-worth his self-value has everything to do with how other people view him and does not come internally. And we see this play out in multiple episodes, including the little kicks here. And that really does explain George a lot. And it really does explain his behavior across these 9 seasons, including this episode. External locus of control, social learning theory. The opposite, of course, is the internal locus, when individuals may hear feedback from others, but understand that who they are and how they view themselves is irrespective to what others think of them. That's the internal locus. Of course, that is a protective factor when it comes to developing a mental disorder, whereas an external locus would be a risk factor, and the mental disorders that would be fairly high in the differential would be in the anxiety, depressive spectrum. Other observations in the little kicks? Anything else to talk about this morning?
Not related to this episode, but have you ever considered that this show is like 90s Always Sunny?
Yes. Yep. We even toyed with the idea of including Always Sunny into the curriculum. Little too dicey.
That's fair. That's definitely fair.
Yeah, we did actually come up with a poster that was accepted to a national conference on Always Sunny. We left it there though. We got about 5 minutes left. What else do you want to talk about this morning about the little kicks? Any other behaviors that caught your eye or caught your attention? All right, we'll leave it there. We will have our table rounds, we'll say in 5 minutes. So we'll give people just a second to catch their breath and reconvene and discuss our patients in 5. Thank you, everyone.